Hi folks, welcome to this recording on bonds. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about issuing bonds where the issue date and the bond date are different, retiring bonds, and also issuing those bonds with accrued interest attached. So let's take a look at the problem that's before us. It says on June the 1st, 2000X5, Bridal Corporation issued 40 million 7.5% bonds, and the 7.5% is an annual rate, and it's the coupon that specifies or helps us to calculate the value of the interest payments that will be made, okay? And it's interest is paid semi-annually on the bonds every April 30th and October 31st. Now, the bonds were originally dated November 1st, 2000X5, and they were 15-year bonds. I'm going to stop here because you'll notice in the question I've highlighted three things. I've highlighted the original date for the bonds, which is November 1st, X5, and also the date that they were issued. And what you'll notice here is that on April the 30th, the first interest payment date would have already passed, meaning that if the bonds were originally dated November 1st, April 30th, X5, if the bonds had been issued on the date they were dated, there would have been an interest payment. But they didn't issue the bonds until June the 1st, which is after the first interest payment. That's significant because the investor is going to pay accrued interest on the issue date for the period within which the issue date falls. Okay, so that's significant. So when you're going to be calculating the present value of the bond, the number of periods that you're going to use there is going to be significant because you're not going to calculate the present value of the bonds for a period within which the investors weren't there. You want to calculate the present value of the bond, okay, for the period that opens the period that the investors bought in and the bonds were issued. So that might sound a little confusing, but I'm sure you'll get it once we show you the visual. But I just wanted to explain that point and why those dates were significant. Now, the bonds were issued to yield 8%, so when we compare the yield to the coupon, we see the yield is greater. The bonds are not paying as much as the market is, so the bonds are going to trade at a discount. And that's what we've kind of clued you into here. So on December 31st, 10% of the bonds are retired for 99% of the par or face value plus any accrued interest that we owed them. We know we're going to owe them accrued interest for 2 months, November and December, because they would have got an interest payment on October 31st, 2000X5. So we know we're going to owe them accrued interest for the 2 months that they were in the game, which is November and December, at the date of retirement. Okay, so now with that in mind, let's have a look at the question. What I've done here is I put together a little bond table for you using Excel. And notice here I've used Excel to calculate the present value. If you're comfortable with that, that's great if you're doing it in Excel. If you're not, I wouldn't worry about it too much at this point because on your midterm, you're going to have to do it, obviously, or in any testing, you're going to have to do it with your calculator. So I put some instructions here using the calculator. So we're going to put in 40 million with a plus minus because it's going to be an outflow, so the issuer is going to pay that out to the investors at the end of the period. 1.5 million will be the payment, and don't forget our payment is calculated as the face value times the coupon, which is 0.075, but you're also going to multiply that by 1/2 because this is an annual rate and the coupon is paid semi-annually. We have a yield of 8%. We use the annual yield, but notice here we're using N not as 30, which is the number of payments that we would normally have in a 15-year bond, but 29, because we're only going to be making 29 payments. All right? Why? Because the first interest payment date, again, if you go back to the question, the first interest payment date would have been April 30th, okay, X5, all right, when the bonds were dated, but the bonds didn't get issued until June the 1st. So the next interest payment date that the investor is going to get interest for is October 31st. These guys weren't there for the first interest payment, so that's gone. The investor is only going to pay interest up front for within the period that the bonds were issued to them because they didn't have the bonds then. So they're going to get interest on the next interest payment date after the issue date, which is October 31st. So we're going to be accruing interest, okay, for May for 1 month, which is after this, right? So there's only 29 periods because they're only going to be there for 29 periods to get an interest payment. So that's why when I did the Excel calculation to calculator calculation, as well as this guy too, you'll notice I only use 29 periods here as well. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, just going to get out of this. Okay, so I'm using n equals 29, and when I compute PV, this is my carrying value. So note here on April the 30th, X5, what I've done, okay, is I've calculated the present value of the bond to open the period that begins May 1st to October 31st. So this is the present value at the end of this period, April 30th, X5. So this period's gone. This is the bond liability at the end of the period, which ends April 30th, or i.e. begins May the 1st. Okay, so these guys bought in when? They bought in this period, June the 1st. All right, so what we're going to have to do, if you look at your question, okay, here's your question. All I did here, by the way, is I put in, okay, in a Word document, okay, all of the things that are in the Excel spreadsheet, because this is the document that I think would be valuable for you to print, because it also includes your required. All right, so I'm going to go to the required now for the question, and in the question we want you to calculate the issue proceeds and the accrued interest. So how are we going to calculate the issue proceeds? Well, the issue proceeds are going to be based on the present value of the bond at the issue date. All right, so what was the present value on June the 1st? Well, if you take a look at your table, I'm going back to the Word document now. You can be viewing it in Excel if you want. It's up to you. We know that the present value of the bond to open this period, which was May 1st, is $38,301,629. All right. So therefore, how am I going to calculate the present value not at May 1st, because that's the present value May 1st, but June the 1st? Well, what I would do is I would take this present value and add to it any discount that I amortized for 1 month of this period, right? Well, this is what I would have amortized for 6 months, because that's a 6-month period. But the present value for a discount bond is going to be the present value to open that period, this period here, plus any amortized discount. Well, if I had had the bond for the full 6 months, right, I would have amortized the whole discount to get a present value of this. But I want the present value at June 1st. So I'm going to take this present value, which opens this May 1st period, which is the period within which the issue date falls, plus 1 month of the amortized discount. So now when I'm calculating here the proceeds, the present value is going to include 1 month of the amortized discount in addition to the present value of the bond to open the period within which the bonds were issued. So that's going to give me present value of $38,306,973, and you would expect it to fall somewhere between here, because June 1st is somewhere between these two dates, right? So now we have our proceeds that we would receive for the present value, but don't forget, these guys are also going to get interest on the next interest payment date, which is October 31st. But don't forget, they're going to get the full $1.5 million on October 31st, even though they've only been there from June to October inclusive. So they're going to pay 1 month, the month of May, they're going to pay up front for the privilege to get 6 months of interest, even though they were only in the game for 5 months. So we are going to have to calculate the accrued interest for 1 month of those entire 6 months, and 6 months interest would be $1.5 million. So when we multiply it, 1 month of interest that they would pay for up front is $250,000. So at issue date, we would expect to get, if we were bridal, we would expect to get $3,556,973. So the requirement 2 asks you to make the journal entry at the issue date, which is your cash that you get, that you calculated in requirement 1. You know that the bonds, the bond payable liability is $40 million, and the interest payable that the issuer will book, this is bridal, is $250,000. So they're going to owe you $250,000, which is going to be part of the $1.5 million payment at the next interest payment date, which is going to be October 31st. Now here, how would you calculate the bond discount? Well, a couple of different ways you can do it. The easiest way for you guys to do it would be to plug it. But if I asked you for calculation, what would you have to do? You should always know how to calculate it so you can check your work. What I'm telling you is that, don't forget, we had here a fully unamortized discount at April 30th of $1,698,371. How did we know that was it? Well, don't forget, the carrying value of the bond plus any unamortized discount is going to give you the face value of the bond, right? So in other words, the face value less any unamortized discount is going to give you the present value. If you're not sure of this, there were videos that are launched in your course on bonds that are issued at a discount, and I would encourage you to go back and review that video if you're having problems with this discussion here, because this is something that we've taught before in your second semester course on bonds. All right? So now, we know that the amount of unamortized discount that we're going to book at issue isn't going to be this, because we didn't get in the game. We weren't in the game April 30th. We only got in the game June 1st, right? So what are we going to do? We're going to say what we bought in when 1 month of discount had already been amortized. So therefore, I would take, if I'm going to make the journal entry, I would take the unamortized discount to open this period, but because the bonds were issued June 1st, I'm going to reduce this unamortized discount on the books by 1 month of this discount that would have been amortized, right? Because you'll notice here that your unamortized discount is reduced every period by the amount of discount that is being amortized. But only 1 month would have been amortized because I bought in on June the 1st. So what I'm doing here is I'm calculating this bond discount on June the 1st, which is the issue date, to be the bond discount that's unamortized to open the May 1st to October 31st period, which is the date within which this issue date falls, less the discount that would have been amortized for 1 month, which is this amount here. So therefore, I would book a discount of $1,693,027 when I make my entry to issue the bonds. Okay, now, let's move forward to the October 31st entry, because that's the date at which you are going to pay out interest. And it should be clear, if you have a look, I don't know if this is going to help you or not, but just to kind of get as much as we can onto one page, this is the journal entry that we made on June the 1st, right? You can see we had an interest payable here of $250,000. Well, at the interest payment date, if we're paying out the $1.5 million to those bondholders, then we no longer have an interest payable because this amount is part of this, right? So how are we going to calculate interest expense? Well, that should be an easier part for you, because the interest expense is going to be what? Interest expense for the 5 months out of the 6 that we were there. That's interest expense from June the 1st to October 31st inclusive. So we don't book interest expense for periods that the bonds weren't issued and in the hands of investors, right? So if we're bridal, we're going to debit our interest expense for $1,276,721. How do I get that? Well, if I go back to the period within which the bonds were issued, which is this period, I have interest expense for the full 6 month period for $1,532,065. But because the bonds weren't issued till June the 1st, I only want 5 months of that 6 month amount. So I calculate 5/6 of it to get this number, which is the amount of my interest expense. So now, you can certainly plug to get the value of your discount, but that's being amortized. But the other way to do it would be to pick up in this same period that we looked at, this amount that you would have amortized for 6 months, just take 5/6 of that, because that's the amount of discount that you would have amortized from June 1st to October 31st inclusive. So that's what I did here. I just calculated this amount here as 5/6 of $32,065. okay, which is right here. All right? So now, let's move on to December 31st, requirement 4, because now we want you to retire 10% of the bonds. So, the first thing you need to do is you need to go in and calculate or update the interest. All right? So now, what do we need to do? We need to take the interest expense and calculate it for 10% of the bonds. Well, don't forget, December 31st now falls within which period? If you go back to your table, October 31st falls in here. If I want to book interest expense, this is interest expense for all 40 million bonds for a full 6 months. I only want to book interest expense on the bonds that I'm retiring, so I only want 10% of this, and I don't want it for 6 months, I only want it for 2 months. Why? I want it for the months of November and December, because at December 31st the bonds are being retired. So if you go down here, there's a little bit of a typo. I calculated interest expense at $51,112. Right here should be a multiplication sign. I'll update it in your hard copy, but I'm not going to re-record video for that. That should be a multiplication sign in here. And when you do that math, you're going to get interest expense of this amount. Similarly, when you calculate the amount of discount that you're going to be amortizing when you book the interest expense, there should also be a multiplication sign there too. Let me put that little guy in. There. So now, okay, we're going to put that multiplication sign in everywhere. Alrighty. So, now what we got here is we've said, what's the discount that we're amortizing going to be? Well, the full discount for that same period, if you go back to your table, is $33,348. That's for 40 million bonds for the full 6 months. I only want it for 10% of the bonds for 2 months, November and December. So that's why I'm taking 10% of it and then multiplying that by 2/6. And clearly, the amount of interest that I'm going to accrue, that $1.5 million again is for 40 million in bonds for 6 months, but I'm going to accrue interest to pay to these guys when I remove the bonds, only 10%, but only for 2 months, November and December. So that's how I update my interest accounts. Now, how about removing 10% of the bonds? This can get a little bit trickier, so let's pay attention. If I'm removing 10% of the bonds, we know that 10% of 40 million is 4 million. Easy enough. We know that we're going to remove, because we're paying out the bonds with the accrued interest, we're going to reduce our interest payable, right? We also know here that the amount of cash that we're going to credit is $4,010,000. How do I know that? Well, let's look at my calculation right here. I retired the bonds, 4 million in bonds, for 99% of the face value, plus the interest that I owed them. That was right here, the interest I accrued. So now, if I take that off the books, it's $4,010,000. That's the calculation. So now, the question is, the loss that I calculated here is plugged, so I got to have a way of calculating the discount on the bonds. How am I going to do that? Well, let's take it a little simply here. Oh, what happened here? Let me see how I can edit this so we can see the whole thing. I think what I'm going to do is maybe I'll just move this down. Your handout should be okay. Yeah, I'll move this down like this. So we have the T accounts where the calculations are. Now, if we look at how we calculate the discount, let's look at it by using a T account. We know that when we issued this 40 million in bonds, we also booked a discount of $1,693,027. So this discount that we set up on June the 1st is associated with the $40 million in bonds. If you're not clear on that, let's go back to what you did. June the 1st, this is where you set up the discount. This is where you set up the bond liability. No problem there. All right, we got that. Now, if you're retiring 40 million in bonds, you want to figure out how much discount am I going to have to remove on that 10% that I'm retiring. Well, I would submit to you, you need to remove that amount, which is 10% of this guy here, $1,693,027. That's how much you got to remove, 10% of it, right? But don't forget, we've already amortized part of this discount, right? We've already amortized part of it. When did we amortize it? Well, we amortized part of it just now. We amortized 10% we amortized some of that 10% when we updated our interest accounts to retire the bonds, when we set up or accrued our interest, right? So of that $169,303, we've already amortized in the A entry here $1,112 of discount. So now, what else is left? Well, don't forget, we also amortized $26,271 on October the 31st when we made our first interest payment. Let's go back, and that's on the full $40 million in bonds. Let's go back and have a look at that. Remember this entry? We did that on October the 31st. We accrued when we set up our interest payment, right? We paid out our interest. We also amortized discount for $26,721. That was for all the bonds, though, for 40 million bonds, right? That was for 40 million. If you remember, that amount of the discount that was amortized was related to a full 40 million. Go back to your handout, you'll see it right here. That's for the full 40 million, right? So all we did at this time is we said, well, we only wanted it for 5 months, right? That $32,065. So we amortized discount of this amount. But again, that's for 40 million in bonds. So we've already amortized part of this $169,303 is this amount, but 10% of it. 10% of our bonds are already covered here, right? Which is $2,672. So when I'm now going to retire the bonds, I have to shore it up. So if I'm saying the amount of discount that I would need to have amortized that relates to this $4 million that I'm retiring is this amount, I have to recognize I've already made 2 entries that already included amortization for $4 million in bonds. So when I retire it, I got to shore it up. So this plus the amount I'm putting here has got to equal this, the amount that needs to be amortized. So on the retirement, to shore it up, to make sure that on the $4 million I've amortized the full amount, I'm going to plug it in, right? That's the amount I need. So I'm going to plug this in here, right? So I can calculate my loss by plugging it up. The total debits have to equal the total credits, right? So now I've got my credit amount here. I can plug this guy. And that's my loss. Okay? So this concludes our presentation on the issuance of a bond when it's issued between interest payment dates. And you also have a bond retirement.